Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. While recently on this channel we have talked about the amazing Simpsons arcade beat 'em up, along with its dreadful sequel that surfaced on mobile devices many years later, it is important to remember that the original arcade classic was a rarity in its day, as the majority of Simpsons games that would be published in the iconic show's heyday would be absolutely tripe. Perhaps the most prolifically remembered of this, in my opinion, bad bunch of games is The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants, a game that personally negatively impacted on my childhood, as I am sure it did for many other people. Rather than creating a simple platforming game, the likes of which was attempted with the majority of other NES licensed games, Bart vs. the Space Mutants on the other hand would instead include a hodgepodge of different mechanics, becoming the jack of all trades and a master of none. In today's episode, not only are we going to look back at the history of this flawed game, but equally as importantly, why this title plays in the strange ways that it does. So without further ado, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants. Yeah! As discussed last week when looking back at the Simpsons franchise, back in 1991 when the arcade game was published, the animated Simpsons television show was receiving critical acclaim for its trailblazing nature, serving as a fantastic satirical parody of a dysfunctional middle-class American family. With Simpsons mania running wild that year, you would think that home conversions of the now classic arcade game was a no-brainer, which is why ports of this game can be experienced on home computers using DOS mode or on the Commodore 64. But beyond these platforms, these were the only places you could experience the game. So what for the popular NES and other game consoles? Well, you see, unfortunately for Konami, they did not manage to receive the rights to be able to publish Simpsons games on home consoles, which is why their game was restricted to the arcade and home computers. Instead, the rights to publish Simpsons games for consoles was snapped up by the license-devouring Acclaim, the same Acclaim who would also regularly publish titles under their now infamous LJN branding. What a shite load of feck. Their library of games have a reputation for being mixed in quality, largely down to the fact that they would contract different studios to make each game, which would be further compounded by time constraints and other factors they would place on them. While this practice is regularly documented in YouTube videos, few people seem to talk about the people who are at the top of Acclaim, who were the brains behind this corporate content farm. In reality, if we are going to discuss Acclaim and the making of Bart vs. the Space Mutants, this would be impossible to do without acknowledging a man known as Greg Fischbach. Who is Greg, you may ask? Well, you know that little company known as Activision, who have been in the news a lot recently for being acquired by another small company. They were at one point a big deal. And in the early 1980s, Fischbach, the already former president of RCA Records, served as Activision's president. Formed by former Atari employees, Activision would change the entire landscape of gaming itself, becoming the first independent game company in history to develop games for the Atari VCS, a move that proved to be so successful that many speculate that their move would result in a butterfly effect, resulting in the US video game crash, due to the fact that so many development houses were formed looking to replicate their success, flooding the market with their games. Due to sales dwindling in the game industry, entrepreneur Greg Fischbach would seek to leave the company, viewing video games as no more than a passing fad, with easier money to be made from doing something else. I guess for Fischbach, he didn't view himself as being in the game development business, but instead, the empire business. However, as Greg was continuing to weigh up his options with regards to his next career move, he got to witness the NES prototype in action at a trade show, which quickly made him reconsider his thoughts regarding the future of gaming. Greg would choose to leave Activision and form his own company, Acclaim, the same Acclaim who had acquired the rights to make Simpsons video games and many other licensed titles. In fact, Greg would sign a deal to make Acclaim the NES's first US licensed publisher. In regards to the game we are covering today, Bart vs the Space Mutants for the NES, this would be directed and designed by a dev known as Gary Kitchen. In an interview with Twitter user IndieGamerChick, Kitchen acknowledges that Greg Fischbach was a genius for recognising lucrative properties, which also included the Ghostbusters license that Kitchen also worked on in the past. Kitchen notes that he too worked at Activision previously at the same time as Greg, and after both of them left to form their own companies, Greg would give him a call after he acquired the Simpsons license from Fox. Knowing next to nothing about what the Simpsons was, Kitchen would phone a friend from the industry known as Barry Marks, who strongly suggested that he should accept the offer to make the game. Kitchen admits he was not familiar with the show at all, but would sit down and watch the first episode with his then wife. Gary Kitchen's now ex-partner told him she thought the show was horrible and was a bit disgusted that he was being encouraged to make a game around it, but he would continue nevertheless. This would lead to a meeting between not only Gary, Barry and Greg, but also Simpsons creators Matt Groening and James L. Brooks too. The people behind the legendary television show would explain to the folks of Activision what they would like to see in the console game, explaining they would like to see a very Simpsons family-centric title where the whole Simpsons family is involved. Going by what transpired in these events, it looks like when the creators met with Konami, that Groening and co put forward a similar proposal, with the Japanese Konami team acting on their wishes and creating a game whereby you could play as 4 different family members. Money-focused, money-orientated and completely money-obsessed entrepreneur Greg Fischbach despised this idea though, and felt that the only character who Acclaim should invest their time into was Bart Simpson, as it was inferred that he was the only Simpsons family member who gamers would want to play as. Still, at this point, the dynamic duo of designers Gary and Barry began to try and create a game based on Groening and Brooks' ideas, brainstorming a title where each level you were controlling a different character, doing skills appropriate for who they were, and Brooks loved it. He goes on to state though that this would cause higher ups at Acclaim to throw an absolute fit, as they had no interest whatsoever in creating a Simpsons game unless it specifically revolved around Bart Simpson and the fact that he owned a skateboard. So if you're one of the rare lucky ones out there who has not had the misfortune of playing this game before, what exactly would be included in the game that Greg Fischbach pushed so heavily to be created? Just as he wanted, players would obviously control Bart Simpson as he makes his way through 5 levels whereby he attempts to ruin a group of aliens' plans to take over planet Earth. The game that over the years has received harsh criticism for its steep difficulty and restrictive controls would be the bane of many people's childhoods. The game, that is a 2D side-scrolling platformer at its heart, is a single-player experience where you play as Bart, who happens to be the only character in the game who knows of the aliens' sinister plans. This results in a lot of quirky gameplay mechanics, for example him having to use X-ray specs in order to identify aliens who are disguised in human forms. Throughout the game, it is Bart's duty to prevent them from collecting items that they can utilise to build their ultimate weapon and take over the world. Think of this as a 1991 version of when, in the early 2000s, Saddam Hussein tried to put a load of PlayStation 2s together to create a weapon of mass destruction. Watch my wife Lady Decade's video on that subject if you want to learn more about that one. Anyway, to progress through the game, Bart must collect or destroy these items to hinder their plans, which is where a whole manner of bizarre design choices for the game were utilised. The complexity of the gameplay was confusing, particularly for kids at the time, with many gamers never even progressing past the first stage. Most games that look like this just require players to traverse from one side of a stage to the other, avoiding and defeating enemies along the way. For Bart in this game, on the other hand, he always has some ridiculous objectives to achieve along the way. For example, in the first stage he must eliminate every purple object so that they cannot be used for the space weapon. This includes using a spray can to simply recolour many of them red. However, in other instances, different techniques must be used, such as covering them with towels, jumping on balls to knock over tins of paint, and more. Players must eliminate every inch of purple to progress, so there is no manoeuvrability at all to make any mistakes. To make matters worse, throughout the game stages, you usually need to gain additional items to progress, which can be purchased with coins collected from aliens. But using these items correctly, such as rockets and cherry bombs, can be rather cryptic at points. To tell you the truth, I despised this game as a kid, because as a 7-year-old, I didn't have a clue what I was meant to be doing most of the time. Moving forward, there is a stage focused around hats, another balloons, exit signs and even nuclear rods. A lot of bizarre themes linking back to the television show. For example, the first stage we've already touched on was programmed in the way that it was, mainly to show Bart using a spray can to reflect his cool dude rebellious attitude. Tubular. Since this was the era of what I like to refer to as Bartsploitation, it was basically a time whereby greedy marketing people like Greg Fischbach wanted to make as much money as possible by pushing radical skateboarders with bad attitudes like Bart. If Bart loses a life in this game, he utters the words, "Eat my shorts," further cementing the whole experience around Bart's perceived coolness and catchphrases. After all, the general public just want a kid with a skateboard who shouts stupid one-liners. They would never gravitate towards his idiotic overweight father instead, right? Like Poochie the dog from the Itchy and Scratchy show, looking through the lens of the past, we all got sick of doing the Bartman very quickly, and were more interested in the Simpsons universe as a whole. But that didn't stop corporate suits from obsessing over this fictional 10-year-old character, which is evident from the existence of this annoying game. Ay caramba! Speaking of the character himself, at least a lot of effort was put into relating to making him faithful to the television show, such as being able to ride the skateboard, or on the first stage, prank calling Moe's Tavern to annoy him. Speaking of elements relating directly to the show, Kitchen is proud of what they managed to work on, bearing in mind they only had about 1% of the Simpsons show canon built at that point, with hundreds of great characters yet to be established. He is pleased with the amount of on-brand gags they managed to cram in. Back in relation to playing the game, another objective of Bart vs the Space Mutants is to help Bart convince the other members of the Simpsons family about the aliens' existence, so that they will help him during the levels. This is achieved when Bart defeats a disguised space mutant, whereupon he collects a letter. Should he spell out the first name of a family member, said member will aid him in a boss battle. The 5 stages are the Streets of Springfield, the Springfield Mall, Krusty Land Amusement Park, a Natural History Museum, and the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. If Bart exhausts all of his lives, the end scene will be shown dependent on what stage it took place, where the aliens gloat over their victory or mock Bart. With regards to how different this game is from the regular platformers we all know and love, Kitchen states, "I wanted the game to feel different from Super Mario Bros. So we spent a lot of time building in puzzles drawing from gags on the show. That was most typified in level 1, which I mostly designed and programmed. As the schedule got squeezed, so did that idea, and many others. Sad." The difference in levels was a conscious decision, but also an inevitable result of different internal teams doing different levels. I was most involved in the first and the last. In regards to the game's quality, Kitchen also notes it sold very, very well and wasn't a bad game, but it could have been superb given more time. He and his team were given an extremely limited time to work on this game, commenting, "I think we started July or August. We had to be done by October to ship for holidays. We killed ourselves but didn't get Nintendo approval until December, with the game being shipped in January." Another element of this game's history that is rarely brought up is how Nintendo were choosing to tread very carefully with regards to being associated with the Simpsons brand. After all, the show already had a reputation for being considered somewhat controversial in 1991. RealOtakuGamer.com's transcription of Indie Gamer Chick's interview notes, for example, that there were arcades in the US that banned the Konami's Simpsons game, and some local Fox affiliates were picketed. Speaking of which, Kitchen's own wife was one of the Simpsons detractors, who would make him study the TV series in another room, on the grounds that she claimed to be a good Christian woman, and didn't agree with the morals on the show. With views like this being common in the States, Nintendo would tread carefully before they approved anything Simpsons related. I mean, think of the children! Speaking of this, Kitchen states that he had a very positive working experience with Nintendo, reporting, "Nintendo trusted me. I've always had a very close and mutually respectful relationship with them. In terms of feedback that the game would receive, as I have already noted, I personally have never been a fan of this one." An author for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica said the levels are not easy, and the Swedish editor of Sega Force described the game as both difficult and boring. Nintendo Power, which rated the NES game 66 out of 100, wrote, "Bart Simpson has finally made it to the NES from Acclaim. His adventure, though, is anything but a game for underachievers. This game is very challenging and could be frustratingly so to some players. The task that you must perform to complete the adventure requires patience and skill." The NES version of Bart vs. the Space Mutants received a B rating from Lou Keston of Entertainment Weekly, who noted that the biggest drawback of this game is its brutally difficult opening section. Due to this being one of those difficult games that rubbed many young gamers the wrong way, in July 2007, James Rolfe, the creator of the Angry Video Game Nerd, would upload a satirical review of the game, whereby he severely mocked its flawed nature. Gary Kitchener would be asked in an interview whether he felt that content like AVGN had further tarnished his game's reputation. Gary would reply, "You can never please everybody. I think there are some very fun parts to the game. I'm the first one to admit that we didn't have enough time to really polish it. Some of the levels are rough, making the game too hard. I do like the nuclear power plant, but no one ever sees it." Looking back at this game and some of the information that I spotlighted today, it quickly becomes clear as to why Bart vs. the Space Mutants is a video game that both looks and plays the way that it does. With this title, like the majority of those published by Acclaim, being a video game that was produced under tight time constraints in order to turn out a product as quickly as possible. Reflectively, based on how well Acclaim games would sell back in the day, there is no doubt that Greg Fischbach's method of tying up popular licenses, then pumping out underpolished games, was a profitable one. As the sad truth is, a lot of us purchased this game, and a lot of us suffered the same frustrations with it. Maybe Fischbach was onto something when he demanded that the entire game should be built solely around Bart Simpson, as, after all, I would hope that full-grown adults would not have been dumb enough to want to play this game. The game, with its complexities, seems to be a combination of trying to shoehorn in as many in-show references as possible, combined with separate development teams working on each stage for the sake of time constraints, which all in all explains why this game feels so disjointed when you compare it to the more beloved NES titles. Despite the game's shortcomings, and despite the fact that many of us think that it's horrible, others still have a strange nostalgia for this game, with the game's designer Gary Kitchen being proud of his work in spite of the criticism and naysayers. After all, why the hell not? It certainly managed to sell a blood enough copies. It's just a shame we couldn't have a port of Simpsons Arcade for the NES instead of this tripe. But I guess I shouldn't have a cow, man. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of The Simpsons, Bart Simpson vs. the Space Mutants. I hope from today's content I was able to relay to you some information that you may have never have heard of about this often mocked game. If you enjoyed this one, why not check out my video on the Simpsons arcade game, or even the horrible mobile beat-em-up that was published in 2009. Be sure to let me know in the comment section if there are other Simpsons games that you would like me to cover in the future. Make sure you like this video, subscribe and ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss out on my future uploads. Videos like this are in part made possible due to the wonderful people who back this channel over on Patreon, allowing me to work on content covering video games' broad history rather than spending all of my time trend chasing for views. Like, be honest, aren't you all glad that you don't have to watch Top Hat Fidget Spinner Man or Top Hat Nintendo Newsman? You lot help me be me. So thank you for that, man. Special Patreon shoutouts go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heo, Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Armarsh Sr., Ron Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Namph, Azure Arkai, Drop King Varela, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs. SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang He, Norma Stitz, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Louis Vian, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who backs my work on the Patreon platform. Thank you so much. Daddy loves you.